The night was quiet, too quiet for a place so deep in the mountains. A fire burned low in the clearing, its crackling the only sound breaking through the heavy silence of the forest. Shadows danced along the rough wooden walls of the cabin, and the man sitting on the porch barely moved, as if carved from stone. His beard was heavy, his frame broader than the doorframe itself, yet his shoulders slumped under a weight no axe could split. He had lived alone for years, wrapped in the stillness of the mountains, letting the seasons carve their stories across his skin the way rivers carve valleys. People in the town below called him a recluse, a giant, a mountain man who had no need for anyone. But they were wrong. Everyone needs something. Everyone needs someone. That night, she stood before him, small, fragile against the backdrop of the endless trees, her voice so quiet it barely stirred the smoke in the air. She looked up at him with eyes that carried storms and sunrises all at once. "You're bigger than my whole world," she whispered, and though the words floated as soft as falling snow, they struck harder than thunder. He should have stood taller, should have worn those words like armor, but instead his eyes blurred. He blinked once, twice, and then the tears came, unbidden, unstoppable. This man who had felled towering pines with a single swing of his axe could not hold back. Something as small as a tear dot, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. He had built his life on silence, on walls of wood and stone, on the belief that the world could not touch him up here. But she had found him anyway. She had climbed higher than most would dare, braved paths too wild for the faint-hearted. And now here she was bringing with her not just words, but a presence that shook the earth beneath his boots. He had tried to resist, tried to keep his voice rough and his heart locked. But nothing about her felt ordinary. She was a reminder of the life he thought he had buried long ago, the part of himself he had tried to forget when the weight of grief had first driven him into the mountains. The wind stirred through the trees, carrying their breath into the night. He wanted to answer her, to say something that could match the depth of her words, but his voice caught in his throat. What could a man like him possibly offer her? He was scars and silence, rough hands and a broken heart. Yet when she looked at him, it was as though she saw something else, entirely something worth saving. He could not understand it. And maybe that was what frightened him the most. The firelight flickered, and for just a moment, it lit the tears on his cheeks. He turned his face away, ashamed of his weakness, ashamed that her simple truth could unravel him so easily. But she didn't step back. Instead, she moved closer, her footsteps soft against the porch boards, her gaze steady. The world seemed to narrow until it was just the two of them. A man who had tried to make himself untouchable, and a woman who had dared to touch the untouchable. Far in the distance, a wolf howled, the sound low and haunting, a reminder that the wild held its own dangers. But neither of them moved. The forest, the night, the fire, they all seemed to hold their breath. What would happen next hung heavy. In the air, an unanswered question, a tension that could snap at any second. And as the flames hissed and the wind bent the trees, the mountain man lowered his head, his shoulders shaking as if carrying something heavier than ever before. She reached out, but her hand hovered just shy of his arm, not yet touching, as if she knew that the smallest movement now could change everything. The night carried its weight like a secret, pressing down on both of them as if the mountains themselves were listening. The man's tears had already told a story, one she couldn't yet understand but felt was older and deeper than the ridges around them. He didn't speak, and maybe silence was safer for him, but silence also held its own dangers. She lingered close, not daring to move away, not daring to move too quickly toward him either. Her words still hung between them, soft, fragile, but powerful enough to split his carefully built world wide open. For years, he had lived here alone. That much she had heard from the townsfolk down below. They whispered about him in the general store over coffee and firewood exchanges. They called him a ghost of the hills, a man who carried sorrow the way others carried tools. Some said he was hiding from something. Some said he had lost everything. Nobody knew for sure. The stories about him twisted like smoke, each one different, but they all ended in the same place. A cabin hidden high in the trees. A man cut off from the world, surviving but not really living. She hadn't meant to find him, not at first. The trails she followed weren't marked on any map, just faint signs that led her higher and higher into the wilderness. At first, she thought she was chasing the silence, searching for something beyond the noise of her own world. But the more she climbed, the more she felt she was being led somewhere or maybe to someone. And now, standing there in the glow of his fire, she wasn't sure if she had been searching for him all along. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, rough skin brushing against tears, leaving streaks of ash and dirt. His voice finally broke through the night, low and uneven. "You shouldn't have come here." The words weren't sharp, but they carried the weight of warning like stones dropped into a still pond. She swallowed, her heart racing faster than she expected. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly, "but maybe I was meant to." He turned his head then, eyes catching hers just long enough for her to see how much he carried. Pain, yes, but something else too, something he wasn't ready to name. He had spent years in these mountains, building walls out of logs, stone, and silence, but walls always crack eventually. Maybe hers was the voice that reached through. Or maybe she was just another reminder of what he had lost. The fire popped, sending a spark upward into the dark sky. The sound startled her for a moment, though he didn't flinch at all. The mountain man was used to sudden noises, the shift of branches, the cries of night creatures. His life depended on knowing the difference between a branch snapping under snow and one snapping under a predator's weight. Every sound told a story. And tonight, the story was changing. She wanted to ask him everything: why he lived here, what he was hiding from, why her words made him cry. But she knew pressing too hard might break whatever fragile connection was holding them together. So she let the silence stretch. Instead, she watched him, how his hands rested heavily on his knees, how his chest rose and fell as if each breath were a battle. The mountain had shaped him. She could see it in the strength of his arms, in the roughness of his face, in the way he seemed more a part of the forest than apart from it. He was the kind of man who could split logs in the dead of winter, who could track a deer across miles of snow, who could hear the difference between a coyote's cry and a wolf's howl. And yet, the same man who had conquered wilderness looked undone by a few simple words. The mystery of him pulled her closer, though she didn't move her feet. What could make someone so strong, so capable, cry like that? She had seen men in the town, hard men who laughed at weakness. But this was different. His tears weren't weakness. They were something else, something raw, something honest. And maybe that honesty was more frightening than any danger the forest could hold. The moon climbed higher, spilling silver light through the trees. Shadows stretched and shifted, painting the cabin walls with moving shapes. She wondered if he lived like this every night, with only fire and silence to keep him company. Did he talk to the stars? Did he carry conversations with ghosts no one else could see? She wanted to know, but part of her was afraid of the answers. He finally spoke again, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "The world doesn't belong up here." His eyes flicked toward the trail she had come from, as though the path itself were dangerous. "And you?" He stopped himself, shutting his mouth tight, as if he had already said too much. Her heart pounded. "And me what?" He shook his head, a shadow of sorrow moving across his face. "You wouldn't understand." But she wanted to. More than anything, she wanted to. The tension between them thickened, pulling her in even while his words pushed her back. It was the kind of pull that felt both dangerous and necessary, like standing on the edge of a cliff just to see how far down the fall might go. The wind picked up, rustling through the treetops, carrying with it a sound that almost masked the sharp crack of a branch breaking somewhere beyond the firelight. His head snapped up instantly, his whole body shifting from weary to alert in a heartbeat. She froze, following his gaze into the darkness, but she saw nothing, just shadows on shadows. He stood slowly, his size even more imposing when he rose from the porch. He reached for the axe leaning against the wall, his hand curling around the handle like it belonged there. "Stay close," he said, and this time his voice held no tremor, only steady command. Her chest tightened. Whatever loneliness or sorrow weighed on him was now replaced by something else: protection, instinct, a readiness she had only read about in stories. He stepped down from the porch, moving toward the trees with careful, silent strides, the firelight falling away from his back until he was just a dark shape against the darker woods. She stood frozen in the doorway of his world, torn between following and staying, between fear and curiosity. The forest beyond the fire seemed endless, alive with eyes she couldn't see. Something was out there. Something had broken that branch. But was it danger? Or was it another piece of the story she wasn't yet ready to know? Her whisper still hung in the air, even though she had spoken it minutes ago. "You're bigger than my whole world." She hadn't meant those words to carry so far, but now they felt like a promise, or maybe a curse. Because now she couldn't look at him without believing it was true. The mountain man disappeared into the dark for a moment, the trees swallowing him whole. Her heart pounded harder, louder, until the only thing she could hear was the echo of her own breath. The fire cracked again, but the sound felt too small, too weak against the enormity of the forest. She wrapped her arms around herself, waiting, wondering if he would come back or if the mountains would keep him forever. And then, faint but clear, the sound of his footsteps returned. But he wasn't alone. The sound of his footsteps broke through the dark first, steady but cautious, carrying a rhythm that spoke of someone trained to move through the wild without leaving a trace. But what unsettled her most was the second sound. It followed just behind him, lighter, uneven, not belonging to him at all. Her breath caught as two shadows emerged from the tree line, his tall frame leading the way, and something else just beyond the edge of the firelight. When he stepped back into view, the fire threw orange light across his face, and she could see he wasn't carrying anything. No animal, no fallen branch dragged in from the woods. But his jaw was set tight, and his eyes flicked back toward the trees as though expecting something or someone to follow. "Was it a wolf?" she asked, her voice breaking through the hush of the night. He didn't answer right away. His hand still gripped the axe handle, knuckles white against the wood. Finally, he shook his head. "Not a wolf. Not tonight." The way he said it made her skin prickle. He wasn't talking about an animal. She wanted to push, to ask what he meant, but he moved past her, placing the axe back against the wall of the cabin. His silence felt heavier now, pressing down on the air between them. She realized then that the real danger wasn't just the wilderness outside. It was whatever he carried inside the past he had tried to bury in these mountains, the ghosts that refused to stay silent. She sat on the porch rail, her eyes fixed on him. He moved with purpose, tossing another log onto the fire, staring into the flames as though they held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. Finally, she spoke again, her words careful. "You've been up here alone a long time." He didn't deny it. He did not either. Instead, he ran a hand over his face, dragging his palm down slowly, as though trying to wipe away years in one gesture. "Alone is easier," he muttered. "Alone doesn't ask questions." "But alone doesn't keep you warm," she whispered before she could stop herself. His head snapped toward her, eyes sharp, as though the words had struck something raw. For a moment, she regretted saying it. But then his gaze softened, the steel in his eyes melting into something tired, something fragile. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her she was wrong. Instead, he looked away again, and that silence told her more than words ever could. The fire roared a little louder, sparks snapping into the night sky, but the sound only underlined the quiet tension between them. She realized then that the real story of this man wasn't about the mountains or the solitude. It was about whatever had driven him here. Something had broken him once, broken him so deeply that the silence of the wilderness felt safer than the noise of people. And now, without warning, she had stepped straight into that silence. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. She thought about the first time she'd heard his name whispered in town. They hadn't called him dangerous exactly, but there was an edge in the way they spoke of him. They said he had seen too much. They said he carried loss like a shadow. And some claimed he was running from what no one could agree. But standing here now, she realized none of them had seen what she saw. A man who could still cry when the world told him he shouldn't. When she opened her eyes, he was watching her. Not just watching, but studying her as though trying to figure out why she had come, why she was still here. His voice, when it finally came, was low, like gravel shifting underfoot. You shouldn't get tangled in this, she tilted her head. Tangled in what? In me. The words landed heavy, but she didn't back away. Something in his tone told her this wasn't just about loneliness. This was about danger, real danger, the kind that didn't come with howling wolves or snapping branches. The kind that came from people, from choices, from the past refusing to stay buried. Before she could answer, another sound rose from the woods, a faint echo, distant but human. Her chest tightened. A voice. Someone was out there, moving through the trees. She looked at him, and his reaction told her everything. He stiffened, his whole body coiled, not with fear but with recognition. Whoever was out there, it wasn't a stranger to him. She wanted to ask, but the look on his face silenced her. He turned back toward the fire, as though steadying himself, as though the flames were the only thing holding him in place. Go inside, he said quietly. She hesitated. What about you? I'll be fine. But you need to stay out of sight. His eyes burned with something she couldn't quite read, fear, anger, maybe both. If they find you here, it changes everything. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might give her away. She wanted to argue, to say she wasn't afraid, but the truth was she didn't even know what she should be afraid of yet. So she slipped into the cabin, the wooden door closing with a dull thud. Inside, the air felt colder somehow, even with the faint warmth of the fire spilling through the window. She pressed her ear to the wall, straining to hear. The forest outside was alive with whispers, the crunch of leaves, the shift of branches, the low murmur of voices she couldn't make out. And beneath it all, his steady breathing, like the sound of the earth holding its ground. She closed her eyes and tried to slow her heartbeat, but questions pressed in from every side. Who was out there? What did they want with him? And why, after all these years of living hidden in the mountains, did he look as though he had been waiting for this night? The door creaked suddenly, and her body tensed. But it wasn't someone breaking in. It was him, slipping inside, his face pale in the firelight. He shut the door quickly, locking it with a heavy iron bar across the frame. His shoulders sagged, as though the weight of the world had been pressing against him, and he had only barely held it back. She whispered, "Who are they?" His eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. "The reason I came up here," he said, and with that, the silence returned, thicker than before, leaving her with the chilling certainty that the danger outside wasn't going away, it was only getting closer. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, like the walls themselves knew a storm was pressing in. He stood at the door, hand still resting on the iron bar, his chest rising and falling with a controlled rhythm that betrayed how tightly wounded he was. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes flicked toward the window as though he could sense every movement in the trees. Whatever or whoever was out there, it wasn't the first time he had heard them. This was familiar to him. Too familiar. She kept her voice low, almost afraid to let the sound carry. "There. Looking for you." He nodded once, a sharp, deliberate motion. "They always have." Her breath caught. Always. The words settled into her bones, cold and certain. He wasn't hiding from ghosts of memory. He was hiding from people who had never stopped hunting. It explained the years in the mountains, the way he'd built a life out of silence and solitude. But it didn't explain why they were here now tonight after all this time. And it didn't explain why she suddenly felt as though she had walked into a story, far bigger than herself. The footsteps outside grew. Clearer, circling the cabin. More than one. She counted 3 at least, maybe 4, moving in slow arcs like predators testing the edge of a trap. The crunch of pine needles under their boots echoed too loud in the stillness. Her heart pounded so hard she thought they must hear it through the walls. He moved toward the window, careful to keep low, his broad frame a shadow against the flicker of firelight. She watched him crouch, muscles taut, his eyes narrowing as he peered through a crack in the wood. His voice was little more than breath when he spoke. "They found me sooner than I thought." "Who are they?" She whispered, but his silence was answer enough. Whoever they weren't strangers, and the thought made her stomach twist. A voice broke the night outside, deep and sharp. "You can't hide forever." It cut through the trees, rattling against the cabin walls. The man flinched, just barely, but it was enough for her to see. He knew that voice. The silence after was worse. No birds, no rustle of wind, nothing but the low hiss of the fire burning down. Every shadow outside seemed alive now, pressing in closer, waiting. She realized then that the mountain wasn't just his refuge, it was also his cage. And tonight, the walls of that cage were closing. He turned back to her suddenly, his expression hard but not unkind. "Stay quiet. No matter what happens, don't make a sound." She wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, but the seriousness in his tone froze her. He wasn't speaking as a man weighed down by grief anymore. He was speaking like someone preparing for a battle he had always known would come. The footsteps stopped just outside the porch. She heard the boards groan under the weight of someone stepping onto them. Her breath hitched, but she didn't move. He straightened, pulling the axe into his hand, his knuckles tight around the handle. In the dim firelight, he looked less like a man and more like a figure carved from the mountain itself, steady and unyielding. The knock came then slow, deliberate, each thud reverberating through the cabin. Not a stranger's knock, not a plea for help. This was a test, a warning. His eyes closed for a moment, as though summoning strength from the silence. When he opened them, there was no fear left. Only resolve. "You have no claim here," he called through the door, his voice steady, carrying into the night. A laugh followed, harsh and cold, echoing too easily in the still forest. "You think these mountains will protect you? You think hiding makes you free?" The voice dropped lower, closer. "Open the door or we burn it down." Her heart raced. She glanced toward him, expecting him to move, to act, but he didn't, not yet. He stood perfectly still, the only movement the faint rise and fall of his chest. She realized he was waiting not for them, but for something else, something only he understood. The seconds stretched long, every creak of wood and snap of firewood making her flinch. She imagined the flames swallowing the cabin, imagined smoke filling the air, imagined the mountain man forced into the open, stripped of his refuge. The thought sent a shiver racing down her spine. Another voice joined the first, sharper, angrier. We know you're not alone in there." Her blood ran cold. They knew. Somehow, they knew she was inside. She pressed herself back against the wall, trying to make herself smaller, quieter, as though invisibility could save her. His grip on the axe tightened, the veins in his forearm standing out in the firelight. He didn't look at her, but his voice carried to her all the same. "Whatever happens, remember, you chose to be here." The words weren't blame. They were a truth, heavy and undeniable. She had stepped onto this path the moment she climbed into the mountains, the moment she spoke those fragile words to him. And now there was no turning back. Outside, the footsteps shifted again, more of them gathering, boards creaking under boots. The sound of metal scraping against wood followed, slow and deliberate. They weren't just here to talk. The tension inside the cabin coiled tighter and tighter until the air itself felt ready to snap. She could see it in him, the way. His shoulders squared, the way his stance shifted, bracing for impact. Every muscle in his body screamed readiness, but still, he waited. The fire popped violently, sending sparks spiraling upward. The sudden noise made her flinch, but he didn't so much as blink. His focus stayed locked on the door, on the shadows waiting just beyond it. And then the first blow came. A fist or maybe a boot slammed against the door, rattling it on its hinges. The iron bar shook under the force, but held. For now, her heart hammered in her chest. Each strike came harder, louder, filling the cabin with a rhythm of violence, each one promising the next would break through. The man didn't move. Not yet, not until the moment he knew was right. His eyes blazed in the firelight, the weight of years of silence, grief, and exile now crashing into the present. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was wait, caught in the space between fear and inevitability, knowing the next moment could change everything. And outside, the voices rose, angry and certain, pressing closer and closer, until the night itself seemed ready to split apart. The pounding at the door grew so violent she thought the hinges would rip free. Each strike sent vibrations through the wooden frame, shaking the iron bar loose in its cradle. She could barely breathe. Fear pressed in from every angle, but her eyes stayed on him. The mountain man who had carried years of silence, yet now stood firm. Shoulders squared, axe gripped tight as if it were an extension of his arm. He looked carved from the very rock. Beneath them, unmovable, unbreakable. Then came the sound of splintering wood, sharp and jagged, and a sliver of cold night air pierced the cabin. She pressed herself back against the wall, heart thundering in her chest. He didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, placing himself directly between her and the door. His voice rose above the chaos, deep and steady. "You don't belong here, not anymore." The hammering paused. For a breathless moment, silence hung heavy again. Then a voice spoke, the same voice she'd heard before, low and sharp with anger. "And you do? You think you can hide forever, up here in the trees? You can't outrun what you owe." He closed his eyes, just for a second, and she saw the truth flash across his face. He wasn't just hiding. He was carrying a past that had never let go. Maybe he had once belonged to their world, maybe he had stood among them before, but something had shattered, and the pieces had never fit again. The door shook again, but this time, instead of fear, she felt resolve filling the cabin. He turned his head, just enough to catch her eyes. "This ends tonight." She wanted to protest, wanted to beg him not to go out there, but something inside her held her back. She saw it then, the way his eyes no longer carried only grief, but something brighter, protectiveness, purpose. For the first time in years, maybe, he wasn't just surviving. He was choosing to fight. With one swift motion, he lifted the iron bar and flung the door wide. Cold air and torchlight spilled inside, blinding for a moment. Figures stood on the porch, shadows stretching long against the firelight. 4 of them, faces rough and hardened, carrying their own weapons, their own fury. The man stepped forward, axe gleaming in the light, his voice booming through the clearing. "You want me? Here I am." The standoff stretched long and tense. She held her breath, watching from inside, every second a thread stretched tight. The leader stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You should have stayed down in the valley. Where you belonged, you could have paid your debt. Instead you ran." Her chest tightened. Debt. The word made everything fall into place. He hadn't come to the mountains just for solitude. He had fled from something that had marked him, something he couldn't undo. And yet, as she watched him stand, tall against them, she knew running had never been the end of his story. The leader raised his hand, ready to signal the others forward. But before the fight could break, the mountain man spoke again, his words cutting through the night. "I'm done running. Whatever you think you own of me, it ends here. I've carried it long enough." The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the torches flickered low, their flames straining against the wind. The men shifted uneasily, and for the first time she saw doubt ripple across their faces. The silence broke not with violence, but with footsteps pulling back. One by one, the figures lowered their weapons, their leader's eyes burning with frustration, but also with the realization that something had changed. The man they had chased all these years was no longer broken, no longer hiding. And without his fear to feed on, they had nothing left. The leader spat on the ground, anger twisting his features, but he turned, signaling the others to follow. Boots crunched against pine needles, fading into the forest until only shadows remained. The fire cracked, louder now in the emptiness, filling the void they left behind. He stood still for a long moment, staring into the trees until he was certain they were gone. Then, slowly, he lowered the axe and let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped inside him for years. She stepped onto the porch, her legs trembling but her heart steady. "It's over?" she whispered. He turned toward her, the firelight catching the lines of his face. For the first time, she saw peace there. Not joy, not yet, but the beginning of something lighter. He nodded. "It's over." The words settled into her chest, warm and certain. The mountains around them stood silent again, their shadows long and unmoving. The danger had passed, but more than that, the burden he had carried seemed to lift, piece by piece, into the night air. They went. Inside, the cabin quieter now, though the fire burned brighter. He placed the axe back in its place, not as a shield this time, but as a tool, nothing more. She watched him sink onto the porch step, his shoulders dropping. The weight he had carried for so long finally set down. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was different now, no longer heavy, but alive, filled with possibility. Finally, she whispered, "You're bigger than my whole world." The words came again, soft and steady, but this time he didn't cry. Instead, a faint smile touched the corner of his lips. He turned to her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but the world feels a lot less heavy with you in it." The night stretched on, but the fear was gone. The forest no longer pressed in as a threat, but seemed to open around them, vast and alive, welcoming rather than warning. For the first time in years, he wasn't a man running from the past. He was a man ready to step into tomorrow. She leaned against him, feeling the strength in his frame, the steady rise and fall of his breath. In the quiet of the mountains, with the fire burning low, they both understood what had changed. The past no longer owned him. The mountains no longer trapped him. And whatever came next, they would face it together. The fire hissed softly, a final ember breaking into sparks, drifting upward into the dark sky. Above them, the stars stretched wide, endless, and bright, as though the universe itself had been holding this moment for them all along. And in that silence, in that peace, the story found its end, not in sorrow, not in fear, but in the simple truth that even the heaviest burdens can be set down, and even the most broken hearts can begin again.